to today's Beyond the Ballot Europe's Democratic Journey series. Today, we're going to be focusing on democratic backsliding and the rule of law in Europe. This speaker series brings together leading experts, scholars, and policymakers to delve into the future of democracy in the European Union, its member states, and its neighbors. Today's session is sponsored by the European Studies Center, which is part of the University Center for International Studies at Pitt. It's co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union, and I want to emphasize today by the U.S. Department of Education through its Title VI Higher Education Act. So today I want to welcome and hand over the floor to our curators and moderators for this series this semester. Alina is a sophomore here at the University of Pittsburgh. She's pursuing a degree in political science with a focus on comparative politics, and she's also working on an honors degree. We also have Kylie, who is a sophomore Nordenberg Scholar studying political science and international relations. She is also minoring in Turkish and history. I will hand it over to our esteemed moderators and curators. Thank you.
Okay, so today I would just like to provide a brief introduction of one of our panelists, Dr. Pieter de Wilde. He is a scholar specializing in European politics and society, holding the chair in European politics and society at the University of Groningen. His research explores political conflict over European integration and globalization, focusing on topics such as Euroscepticism, EU responsiveness, and the role of national parliaments. Before joining in 2024, he held academic positions at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology and conducted research at the Berlin Social Science Center. His projects include studies of unelected representatives' impact on liberal democracy, social media's influence on political preferences, and democratic backsliding in the EU. De Wilde earned his PhD from the University of Oslo, examining the politicization of European integration.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm going to shed some light on the topic of democratic backsliding from a political sociological point of view, which highlights a couple of major trends that I see happening in Europe and beyond, which have also major repercussions for understanding what is going on today and what we might expect in the near future. So I'll try to sketch 4 paths towards democratic backsliding that we've seen happening co-occur over the past decade or two. The first one I've called democracy equals good, which is, in my perception, the spreading idea amongst large sections of the population that democracy is equals good in the sense that if something is right, it is democratic. If I don't like it because there's politics ongoing that it doesn't really fit my agenda, then that is not good, and not good automatically then means undemocratic. It's quite an interesting change if we think over a couple of centuries how the idea of democracy has changed, and how until the Renaissance, basically, we were questioning democracy, whether this is really such a good system. But these kinds of questions seem to have moved out, and we tend to now consider democracy to be the best system, to the point that we learn also in school democracy is to be cherished, democracy is good. And then when things happen that do not fit that image, we immediately start questioning the democratic credentials. And the second path is about nostalgia and relative decline. The idea that society as we have it is moving in the wrong direction, which creates a lot of resentment that populists and those who might want to pursue an autocratic path could exploit. Fearful people are easily to manipulate. You've seen Donald Trump's recent inaugurational speech, where he said the decline of America ends here, that is clearly playing to this kind of sentiment that it used to be better in the past. We're losing privileges, we're losing competitiveness, we're losing prestige, and something drastic needs to be done about it. Preferably some strongman taking us down a new path. The third one is about the norms in public debate. This is an argument that we've seen Levitsky and Sieblatt make in the book How Democracies Die. They argue that what we really need is a kind of respect for the rules amongst political elites. The idea that elections can be lost, and this is not the end of the world, because there will be a rematch a couple of years down the road, and we respect the other side. We don't agree with them, but we respect them, and if they come to power, we will cede it peacefully. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the normalization of the radical right. So here's the third thing that I highlighted. And in democratic politics and in political theory, we often use complicated terms of agonistic versus antagonistic politics. And it's really about how we see the other side, how we see our political opponents. Do we imagine politics to be like a game of soccer, which is your picture on the left, and it could be any sports or any team sports, which is basically a match that has a fixed setup, a bunch of rules about what is acceptable and what is unacceptable behavior. There's a referee who maintains respect for those rules, and in the end, one side wins. We all shake hands and we go our separate ways, knowing that it was just a match. It was just sports, even though it can be quite intense. And in the end, there'll be a rematch, a chance for the losing side to have another go. Quite the opposite of thinking about politics as if it is war. That is the picture in black and white here, with the antagonistic perspective. In this idea about politics, the other side is the enemy. It is not the opponent to be defeated according to the rules of the game. It is the enemy to be destroyed at all costs, because if we don't destroy them, they will destroy us. In this kind of perspective, everything is at stake, right? If there's no option of losing, because losing means annihilation. If losing becomes annihilation, then parties and political elites, individuals, are willing to do whatever it takes not to lose, including taking drastic steps that really challenge our democratic institutions. So how do we see these kinds of things? Well, here is an image from a publication I co-authored with Anna Gora in the Journal of European Public Policy a while ago. It depicts declining trends, 5 declining trends over time. The image here starts around the year 2004 and runs until 2018. These trends that you see declining here, they are the key elements of a democratic system inside the European Union, which contain at the top, this kind of dark bluish line is about polyarchy. These are the basic rules, whether there are free elections and competing political parties in place, and people have universal suffrage. That's the core. But democracy, at least liberal democracy, contains on the one hand the majoritarian rule element, and on the other hand, separation of powers. That is captured in the second trend called liberalism here. Are there effective checks and balances, different institutions that are able to control each other, executive, judicial, and legislative institutions separate? The third one is about egalitarianism. This is mostly about income differences. If there's too much of a diversion here, then we create too much economic basis for resentment, plus the exclusion of those on the bottom who are then not able to fully participate. But the key message here is this fourth line, the orange or yellowish one. It's about deliberation. This features the steepest decline, mostly after basically 2013. What happens here is the erosion of the norm that we have a respect for the political opponent, that we see the political opponent as a worthy adversary, a legitimate partner who we want to defeat but not destroy. This is the message I just try to capture with this analogy of war versus sports. That is deteriorating the most. And that is, according to us in this article, the essence of democratic backsliding in Europe. We're losing respect for the other side. And you see that in public discourse. You see how political elites talk about each other and how they refer to political opponents with kind of terminology that implies that they're considering them an enemy to be annihilated rather than an opponent to be defeated. Now, finally, and I think this is a nice bridge to our second speaker, what we have seen in the European Union is recently a lot of discussion on rule of law, mostly. And my view on this, and I'm curious to hear Michael's view in a second here, is that rule of law can be seen as basically a house, the walls. It's the main building of democracy. And what we observe there are cracks when elites try to challenge basic things like the independence of the judiciary. Right? Is our courts separate from politics and isolated from political elements? But the message I want to pinpoint here, and I've been trying to argue to EU circles, whom I think are a little bit too much focused on rule of law issues, is that underpinning this rule of law house is the foundation of the structure. And that is about democratic political culture. What we really see happening in this picture, and I think, of course, chosen that because I think it somewhat resembles what we see happening in Europe, is that we have cracks in the foundation, which then translate into cracks in the building. So we first observe problems in the democratic political culture, particularly, as I've tried to argue, in how elites talk to each other and refer to each other. And these then translate, because elites become less willing to lose, into challenges to major institutions, which we observe as rule of law problems. The key problem, I think, is that if we wait until we see cracks in the building, we're basically too late, because the cracks in the foundation are already there for a while, and they become hard to repair unless we address the root of the problem. I'll leave it there, and I'm more than happy to discuss questions and further issues down the line. Thank you.
Well, thanks for sharing that. It was very great insight. Our next guest is Dr. Michael Blauberger. He has been teaching and researching at the University of Salzburg since 2011. He studied political science, public international law, and economics at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich and the University of Paris. He wrote his doctoral thesis on European state aid control at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies, Cologne, and the University of Bremen. His publications appeared in peer-reviewed journals such as the Journal of Common Market Studies, Journal of European Public Policy, Western European Politics, and many, many more. Dr. Blauberger is editorial board member of the Journal of European Public Policy and coordinator of the Doctoral Fund's Doctoral College Challenges of European Integration. In his current research, he investigates EU action against democratic backsliding and protection of mobile workers in the EU's internal market. With that, we'll turn it over to you for your introduction.
Thanks, Kylie. Then I also share my slides. I hope, can you see it?
Yes.
In full screen mode. So then, thanks for the invitation and for the introduction. I mean, I think you invited us to present complementary perspectives. I'm very much focused on EU politics and what the EU does or tries to do against democratic backsliding. I prepared a few slides. I think your email mentioned our research interests. I won't go into detail about the variety of research interests, but that's why I prepared that slide. Maybe just two remarks that I'm doing my research in an interdisciplinary context with political science, that's my field, but also lawyers and economists. I used the opportunity to advertise our master. So that's also my main, or in a broad sense, my main field of interest is politics and law. For example, how the Court of Justice shapes political integration in the EU. And I mean, I fully agree with what Pieter said on that it's more than just a rule of law crisis, or more fundamentally a crisis of democracy in the EU. I have two ad hoc ideas why there's so much talk about rule of law crisis. I mean, in terms of disciplines, that's also what I experienced in Salzburg and with other colleagues. It's for lawyers, it's more natural to talk about the rule of law crisis. And I think from a political science perspective, it's obvious that it's more than that. And rule of law is one aspect, or as Pieter argued, more basic than the, for example, the independence of the judiciary. In the EU context, I think it's also because the EU and the EU institutions feel more comfortable to talk about rule of law, because that's where they have more competence or a bit more solid operationalization of what the rule of law actually is, whereas the EU often lacks the competence to tell member states like how they should design the electoral system, or, for example, or how they should handle media freedom, for example. So sometimes I think it's a competence issue, but I agree, and I like in political science circles, I think the more common term is really democratic backsliding, also as you chose it for today's discussion. So I prepared 3 slides on. I tried to address some of the questions also that you sent us in advance, and I tried to cluster them on 3 slides. Hopefully easy to understand. I mean, if you're interested in going more into the current research on the topic, we just published a special issue in the Journal of European Public Policy on, like, with really many scholars working on democratic backsliding and what the EU can do, or what the EU currently does against democratic backsliding. So 3 slides along these lines. Why is democratic backsliding a problem for the EU? That's what I start with. So first of all, I'm happy that Pieter did not address all the issues already in his presentation. I'm 2 slides that are more focused on Hungary and Poland, which are the usual suspects if we talk about democratic backsliding in the EU. And there you can see, so the green line here is Hungary. That is, according to Freedom House and also according to the BDEM indicators, not classified as a democracy anymore, but as an electoral autocracy or a hybrid regime. So it has been declining since 2010 when Viktor Orban was elected, and Poland since 2015 has taken a similar path, not as dramatically as Hungary. And as you know, in 2023, the Law and Justice government lost the elections. This year there will be presidential elections in Poland, so there is at least a certain possibility of democratic recovery. But like the second table of BDEM shows that Poland and Hungary even were worldwide considered the most autocratizing countries. So not just in the EU, but worldwide. So you could say that's a big problem for Hungary and Poland, but why is it a problem for the EU? And I actually think for some time the EU tried to live with the illusion that it's mainly a problem for Hungary and Poland, but shied away from confronting it really as an EU issue. And one question that you were asking in the email we received was whether we think there could be exits of countries subject to democratic backsliding. And I don't think that's, at least currently, I don't see that any of these, for example, Hungary or Slovakia, which is on a path towards democratic backsliding, will leave the EU. I think the bigger problem is erosion from within. So the EU cannot expel a country, and I don't think Hungary, for example, which has many benefits of being a member of the EU, will voluntarily leave. But I think the problem is erosion from within. So first of all, it's a violation of the EU's fundamental values. If the EU is not only perceiving itself as an internal market, but also a political community, a community of shared values, then of course democracy, rule of law are among these fundamental values, and they are violated. I think it's a problem there's a big debate about the democratic deficit of the EU and not just of its member states. And there's the European Parliament, which is directly elected, but the second strand of legitimation of EU politics is via national governments. So, for example, ordinary legislation is adopted by the Parliament and the Council of Ministers, but that, to be democratic, presupposes that governments are elected democratically, and if there's autocratic or autocratizing countries in the EU, then that undermines this strand of democratic legitimacy. It also has an external dimension. If the EU wants to promote democracy, rule of law, its fundamental values in its neighborhood, in candidate countries, then of course it's a big problem for the EU's credibility if it tolerates backsliding among its member states. And finally, and I think Hungary is the most obvious case, that already years ago, I think long before the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, scholars have argued that Hungary is kind of a Trojan horse for autocratic influence, in particular from Russia. And so that's a further problem, not just for the country, but for the EU altogether. So why has the EU done very little, at least for the first 10 years? So Hungary started the government, Orban government started to erode, to backslide in 2010. And I think there's quite a consensus in research that for at least 10 years, the EU has largely failed to counteract. I think I don't go into details about these different instruments, infringement action or Article 7, but there would have been binding enforcement tools in the EU which were used very little or not at all. What the EU has done instead is it created many soft, non-binding instruments, dialogues, annual reports, resolutions, communications. There's an article by Dan Kelemen who argued what the EU has done is actually it has built such a Rube Goldberg machine where you have a very complex system with very little effect. And I think I like the image. That's his argument of what the EU has done between 2010 and 2020. Why? So there are different arguments, and I think they relate to the different institutions of the EU. On the one hand, there's the Council and the European Council, and one argument is that governments and ministers are particularly concerned about their national sovereignty. They don't want to be subject to strict EU enforcement themselves, and so they are more reluctant also to support enforcement action at the EU level. They have a very strong consensus norm, so they do not want to act against their peers, or they are they have been very reluctant. The European Commission, which is supposed to be the guardian of EU law, often has a preference for trying to solve these issues through dialogue, through soft means, persuasion, rather than enforcement. And the European Parliament, which has been the most vocal advocate of acting more strictly against, in particular against Hungary and Poland, still hasn't spoken with one voice. And in particular vis-à-vis Hungary, the problem was for a long time that Fidesz, the Hungarian governing party, was member of the European Conservatives in the European Parliament, and so they protected for a long time protected Hungary from harsher criticism by the European Parliament. Still, in recent years, there has been more action. I guess you could still say too little, too late, in particular if you take Pieter's argument that the problem is much more fundamental than just the erosion of an independent judiciary or media freedom in these countries. But what the EU has done is that it adopted a legal act, the conditionality regulation, and introduced different forms of budget conditionality. And it froze large sums of EU funding for Hungary and for Poland, still ongoing for Hungary until 2024 for Poland. I think there are two main reasons, or that's what we argue in a co-authored article with a colleague, that there are two main reasons why the EU has become stricter recently. One is that backsliding countries, in particular Hungary or the Hungarian government, have increasingly played an obstructionist role at the EU level. So this illusion that it's just a Hungarian problem collapsed even for the really the defenders of Orban for a long time, because in particular vis-a-vis Russia and the question of Ukraine, but not only, the Hungarian government has become an obvious problem at the EU level, and that that's probably not the best reason then to act against democratic backsliding, but it's quite hypocrite, I think. But that's one argument why frustration has grown at the EU level. A second mechanism or argument we make in that article is that also there are domestic incentives for mainstream, in particular center-right parties in the non-backsliding countries, to distance themselves from people like Viktor Orban, who have become toxic in recent years. So we argue that, or we show that there is a growing awareness also in Western Europe in particular about democratic backsliding in Hungary and Poland. And it's not the most important topic, obviously, for citizens in Western Europe, but it's an issue where center-right parties don't want to risk a liability being perceived too close to Viktor Orban, and acting against democratic backsliding is one way to signal their determination to do something, and that's why also some of the former allies of Orban in Western Europe have distanced themselves and have supported tougher EU action. I would have a third slide. Is that still, or am I already talking too long? What do you think? It's the most speculative one. Well, of course, the most interesting one. Can the EU have any effect? But I could also keep it for the discussion afterwards, or as you like.
Good. We can open that for more questions.
Sorry?
But that would be good. We can address it as we move into the question and answers part.
I didn't hear it. So, I mean, I can do it in 1 minute, and then we, as I said, it's the most speculative one. So, can EU action be effective? Can these sanctions be effective? I think there's two main considerations, at least I had. One is it really matters whether the EU applies these sanctions credibly, and I do have some doubts. Even though the EU has become stricter in recent years, the whole funding for Poland was unlocked pretty quickly after the new government came into power, and actually based on promises. So Poland has, the current government in Poland has not done very much, and they are also not able, because the Polish president is still a defender of the reforms of the Law and Justice Party and has a veto power. So basically the new government promised that they would try to rebuild an independent judiciary and other tackle other problems regarding the rule of law and democracy in Poland. But the EU has already unfrozen all the money that had been locked. Hungary, I think, is constantly trying to veto or obstruct other EU policies in order to extract concessions on the rule of law and the frozen money. And the constant struggle is, do other EU leaders give in and try to accommodate or appease Hungary in order to build a united front, for example, vis-a-vis Russia, or do they stick to strict enforcement? I think credibility is also crucial, even if EU measures might be too little too late to save Hungary, they might still be relevant to deter other countries like Austria or like new governments in Austria or the Slovak government to follow the Hungarian path. And then, I mean, that probably links also to Pieter's presentation. I don't think the EU will save democracy in any of its member states. That would clearly overestimate the abilities of the European Union. After all, it's also the election, like the Polish elections. So that's the most positive development. That's because people voted against the law and justice government, and the EU needs strong defenders, and that's probably more likely. That was more likely in Poland. It's also a bit better in Slovakia, but that's not I mean, there are also some signs that the Hungarian opposition is uniting behind one strong man, but still, that's a big problem in Hungary. Yeah, I leave the two other issues maybe for the discussion. There are some two further thoughts I had, but I stop sharing my slides and we can discuss first.
Thank you guys so much for both of your very in-depth presentations. I think a lot of us learned a lot of new things. So my question is sort of directed at Dr. Wilde. So you mentioned how there is an erosion of respect for your political opponent. I was just wondering, why is there that erosion of respect, and can it be connected to the rise of populist leaders?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think to a large extent, we have to think about populist rhetoric. So we've seen far-right populist politicians and parties throughout Europe come to power or strive to come to power and gain electorally. And they often use quite polarizing language in which they try to depict everybody else as some collective conspiracy elite, and themselves as the antagonists to that, the representatives of the people, which then leaves open what exactly the people is. But it's a holistic, monolithic entity of like-minded individuals that make up the truly deserving population. So populist rhetoric, populist politicians using polarizing rhetoric is definitely part of this. But what I find really fascinating is an argument by Levitsky and Ziblatt in How Democracies Die, where they basically try to trace back this deterioration of the democratic culture to, and they look at the United States, but I don't think the situation in Europe is very different. Back to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And they basically have a very depressing message. And the message is, people don't accept equality. Democracy rests on the exclusion of a large group of the population. And the minute this exclusion is alleviated and everybody does have equal rights, then the previously privileged group starts protesting and arguing, we want to go back basically to the time when we were in charge, or when democracy was for us. And this is really striking that throughout history, democracy largely has been a system that did not have universal suffrage, that first excluded slaves, children, women, And later, women have been excluded more or less from democratic politics for a very long time in some countries up until the 1970s. The civil rights movement was in the 60s, and there's major decolonization movements in Europe still going on. Even though then citizens might have gotten formal rights, the full participation is still lacking. And what you get then is protest from the people that were in charge, the white native population, men in particular, who see their own role as declining, their privileges disappearing, and have a challenge with accepting equality.
This one I'd like to hear from both of you about, revisiting the issue of Hungary. What can you both imagine the consequences of Orban's current hold over the Council of Europe's rotating presidency? Can you imagine any ramifications from this, or will it just be kind of a slower agenda set for the next year?
Should I start, Pieter? So, the rotating council presidency, Hungary already held, right, in the EU, and I think that was my idea already before, that it's a half a year that is, probably not the best 6 months for the EU, but it's also a very short period of time. So I didn't understand the big fuss about it. I actually thought the EU institutions reacted quite smartly in the scholarship. There were some hardliners, I think, who always pushed for, like, let's act as strongly as possible against Hungary. And there was a debate whether the rotating presidency could be withdrawn from Hungary. And I think this would have given Orban the best pretext he could get to say, see, they are inventing new rules just to punish our government. It's not the rule of law either, because they are making up these rules. It's our right to hold the presidency. What the EU actually did, I thought, was much smarter, that they partly, so a big motivation for, in particular, smaller countries in the EU for this presidency is because it gives a lot of prestige. You can host summits in your country, and it's good, it gives good pictures. And the EU, simply didn't go to some of these meetings in Budapest, but held alternative meetings in Brussels. So they kind of undermined this PR effect of holding the presidency. But I think if Poland was still also backsliding, it would have been a bigger problem, because now Poland holds the presidency, and then it would have been an entire year of. But I think it's not such a big problem, and the EU should be careful not to invent rules to punish backsliders. Because I think Orban is very smart in playing that game. That they don't care about rule of law. They don't like our family policy, and because we are peace loving, and they don't like that, and then that helps him pushing that narrative. But maybe Pieter has an additional.
Yeah, I think what's really important, from my more political sociology perspective, these trends of backsliding, they happen over decades. It's not a question of months or one election. It's a long-term process and a long-term struggle. So in that sense, I would agree with Michael that this 6 months presidency is not essential. What it does do is contribute to the normalization of the far right. So it allows Orban, in this case, to present himself as a legitimate ruler, a successful one, and he has managed to build up that persona inside Europe, that he is seen by like-minded people in other countries as an example. Right? Here's how we can push through our conservative far-right agenda, and look at Orban for inspiration. And that it contributes to. But again, this is a long-term process.
So another question I have for both of you is, does having a history of being a part of the Soviet Union or a satellite state of the USSR contribute to backsliding in these countries today? Does it make these former USSR countries more susceptible to democratic backsliding?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a great question, I think, because it allows for unpacking the vulnerabilities of democracies in Europe a bit more. Clearly, we've seen some of the major trends of democratic backsliding in not necessarily former Soviet states, but certainly for former Warsaw Pact states, Hungary, Poland, notably. What I think is essential here is the quality or the depth of democratic culture. How well ingrained is this? How many people are there who have grown up in a democracy, have gotten used to that, see democracy as the game in town, the one game in town, and any alternative as problematic. And that's of course a smaller number in former Warsaw Pact countries because they became democratic in the 1990s, and many people grew up before and were accustomed to another system. So another element that I think is particularly present, notably in Hungary, is this nostalgia towards the past. Hungary used to be a much bigger country. In the past, they've lost a significant amount of their territory. There are many people that they consider to be ethnic Hungarians living over the border in Romania and in other European countries. So it's easy to kind of cultivate the past as a more glorious time. And it's easy to cultivate a narrative of victimhood. We are the victims. First of all, it was the Nazis that overran us, and then it was the Soviets, and now it's Brussels. And poor us Hungarians were stuck in the middle of this kind of imperial violence. So that is I think what is mostly happening here. The less fleshed out, less robust democratic culture because of a more recent history. And then we should also focus on what Russia is doing, what the Russian government is doing, because they see these states still as, to a large extent, in the Russian orbit of influence. The closer it gets to Russia, the more likely the current Russian government is willing to assert influence to try and keep them in that orbit. They've suffered a major loss in their eyes when the EU enlarged towards the East, and when NATO enlarged. They see that as a loss of faith, a loss of prestige, which they would like to reverse. So they're willing to interfere. They're willing to try and create polarization and actually play into this shift of discourse that I try to sketch from politics as a game or sports towards politics as war. There are plenty of examples of Russian trolls actively contributing to this kind of more aggressive language in these countries, notably. So it's more, what does the Russian government do today, and what is the history of the robustness of the democratic culture, than whether or not they were part of the Soviet Union, in my eyes. Thanks.
Maybe to add a little bit, I mean, it's not, as I said, I'm more focused on the EU level and not an expert on domestic politics in Poland or Hungary. I think, I mean, one discussion in the EU studies is whether there was too much optimism about the accession process and the democratic conditionality for these countries before joining the EU. I think people were aware that it's not an easy transition process, and that with the accession to, I mean, there were some people who argued that basically membership in the EU would lock in a democratic transition in these countries. But I think that many people were aware that 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 democratic backsliding could happen. Still, Hungary and Poland would not have been the obvious candidates for democratic backsliding. So for many, in particular, Poland and Hungary were basically the masters of successful democratic transition. And one argument I find very interesting in the literature is that it's not just a back to communist legacies, or that they never overcame their Soviet or Warsaw Pact past, but that actually these leaders, some call them ethno-populists, have been quite innovative in, for example, I think Orban and also the Law and Justice Party tried to frame themselves as the true defenders of democracy, and everything that was kind of a compromise after 1990 was then perceived or portrayed as not a full transition, and only they were the ones then who could overcome so they didn't really build on their pre-democratic tradition in that sense, but portrayed themselves as the true Democrats. And then I think Pieter is completely right in this narrative of victimhood, and now it's the EU, like what the Soviets haven't been able. Now the EU is the imperial power in these narratives. I mean, another additional explanation is that, of course, the economic transition also created many losers in Central and Eastern Europe, which provided a fruitful ground for these ethno-pop. Often they combine this nationalist or right-wing rhetoric with quite left-wing social policies, in particular in Poland, addressing these economic losses due to the transition process. So that's so I think it's still puzzling why Poland and Hungary. I have one colleague who has the thesis, so why not Czech Republic or Slovakia? I have one colleague who has the thesis, it's pure luck that they didn't, that they did not backslide so far. I guess also really charismatic leadership, and in the case of Orban is also an explanation. So it's complicated. I think it's not just building on the pre-democratic past of these countries.
Now, going to a more global stage, following the recent inauguration of President Trump in America and the outpouring of support from European populists like Orban and Fico, can you imagine the second term of Trump having any ramifications on politics in Europe?
Yeah, Michael, shall I start? Yeah, definitely. I mean, first of all, it's important to realize how much Europeans look at the United States, how important culturally the United States still is for Europe, in the sense that many people follow what is going on. Many people can relate to things that are ongoing in U.S. politics. Major new developments in U.S. politics have a tendency to move over the Atlantic and then resonate in Europe as well. Like we've seen, for example, the Me Too movement move from the U.S. to Europe. The Black Lives Matter movement, similarly, it starts in the U.S. We closely follow what goes on there, and then it resonates in Europe too. Many people know Donald Trump and major U.S. politicians better than they do the politicians in other European countries, and sometimes even better than politicians in their own country. It's that kind of prominent. This differs a bit from country to country, of course, how much the focus is on the U.S., but it's quite well spread. And in that sense, like Orban's presidency of the European Council, it is also is again a successful far-right populist politician who shows how it can be done, and that it can be done, and that the world doesn't immediately fall apart when they get to power. and that contributes to the normalization of the far right. And now in Europe, the situation is more or less that the politics in most European countries can be seen in three major groups. We have the left, which is basically social democratic parties and green parties and some social liberal parties. And there's the center right, which is made up of liberal parties and Christian democratic parties and mainstream conservative parties. And then there's the far right, which is made up of populists like Orban and Fico and Wilders, etc. And these three groups, they're about equally big electorally. So they each get around 1/3 of the vote in elections. Of course, that goes up and down, and it's from country to country a bit different, and it depends on the economics, and it depends on charismatic leadership and a bunch of other things. But more or less, that's the structural situation, and that this puts the center right into a key position because they are the kingmakers, right? They can choose to form a coalition with the left or with the far right, and we see them moving back and forth, making different decisions. But at some point, there might not be one single center-right party that comes out the biggest in an election, and then we see a situation where the far right, if they do have one charismatic leader who's able to mobilize that section of the electorate, can play a more influential role. So in that sense, Trump, like much in U.S. politics, does resonate a lot in Europe. Of course, a key difference is that most European countries do not have this first past the post system that the U.S. has, where elections are a winner takes all, right? You either become president and you get everything, or you lose the election. We have a proportional system in most countries, and then you get this 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 division, and it becomes a compromise coalition. So in that sense, it's not such a clear shift back and forth in most European countries. But this kind of cultural resonance is also one of the things that if in the final thing I'll say here, is that is often overlooked in comparative political research, which tends to focus on domestic origins, domestic causes of democratic backsliding, and overlooks these kinds of transnational patterns where one person's leadership in a country resonates in others and is then basically copied by leaders elsewhere. But I wouldn't be surprised to see European far-right leaders echo Trump's major points if and when they see that they are successful in the US.
Okay, I add, first of all, I completely agree with what Pieter, unfortunately, I mean, if you read the newspaper at the moment, also in Europe, it's just Trump everywhere, right? Like every minor remark makes it into the headlines. So that's what Pieter said, that people are, I think in the news at the moment, there's more Trump than domestic politics in many regards. I have a few, so if at a very general level, your question was whether there are any ramifications. I think they will, I mean, in all major policies, of course, it matters for Europe what the US does. So if it's climate change or Ukraine or trade, so in all these fields, of course, it's highly important what the US government does. If I look more closely at democratic backsliding and rule of law, I can think of several influences. One, I think, and mainly negative influences. One could be that President Trump will keep the EU busy with other crises. So struggling with trade or climate change, Ukraine. And then in the past, I think that often meant that the EU tried to compromise with Hungary or appease countries like Hungary or Poland in order to build a united position on more pressing crises. And I think as Pieter said, democratic backsliding is a very long process. And I think it's also a slow burning crisis. And often there's the perception that it's a bit with climate change, that often the perception is there's something more pressing. And so we don't enough against climate change because we have to deal with Ukraine and Russia first. And I could imagine if the EU is preoccupied with different crises in relation to the US and the Trump government, that they might compromise on rule of law enforcement. A second, I doubt that will be the case, but of course, if Orban manages to it's a bit also Meloni in Italy, if they manage to build an image of having an influence on Trump or being a channel to Trump, that of course that will increase their standing inside the EU. I think over the last years, Orban has really become toxic for many other politicians, and they do not want to be seen with Orban. I mean, if he manages to increase his standing because he has a more direct link to Trump, that could change. But I think that probably overestimates the role of Orban. A last point where I'm not so sure, I had that on my slide, and Pieter mentioned it, this normalization of the far right. So in general, I agree that that's a problematic trend. On the democratic backsliding rule of law issue, I don't know if that's very relieving, but what I see at the moment is that this normalization takes place in other policies. For example, there's a huge shift to the right in migration or anti-migration discourse across Europe. I think with respect to democratic backsliding, it could be an issue that's used by center-right parties to distance themselves from the extreme right. Because, I mean, people probably do not care enough about democracy and the rule of law to defend it. But I don't think it's a very popular, even in Poland and Hungary, it's not a popular policy to undermine the independence of the judiciary. It was just there were more important issues for the Polish population, for example, that they voted for the law and justice government, like these social policies and also the nationalist discourse, I think. But it might be an issue, so at least that's slightly more optimistic on that issue, that it might be an issue where the center-right sees it as an opportunity to distinguish themselves from the extreme right in a way that is compatible with their constituencies.
I think if I can say one more thing before we bring it back to Pittsburgh, what will really matter is what Trump rolls out as agenda, right? Because some of his agenda really fits with the far right in Europe, like his anti-migration agenda or anti-woke agenda and anti-separation of powers or liberalism focus. But so the more he does like this, the more it will be an inspiration and boost to far right movements in Europe that are behind democratic backsliding. But if he starts attacking Europe, like claiming he wants to buy, and if not buy Greenland, and if it's not sold to him, then he'll take it by force, or he threatens trade wars with the European Union, that could be quite a different story, because that could be used by the center-right as an argument that Europe needs to stand alone, that on the one hand it's attacked by China and Russia, and on the other hand it can't rely on the US protection anymore. In fact, it might get attacked from the US side and needs to stand alone in their in respect to them as well, and build a kind of security narrative. Europe needs to now take care of its own security. That's not just military security, it's also cyber security, it's energy security, it's food security. You can attach the security narrative to pretty much any policy area, but it's about making Europe independent from these or making it less dependent on these kind of security guarantees that the US used to provide, and on cheap Russian gas and a bunch of other kind of international interdependencies. We've already seen this since 2018. Macron started with the narrative L'Europe qui protège, which is French for the Europe that protects. That's been adopted by the main center-right party, Europe that protects, as its central slogan. And here I see quite some potential for the center-right to take the wind out of the sail of far-right populists pushing a democratic backsliding agenda, because people will be less worried about immigration when they are concerned about their main security. And the more Trump plays into this narrative by bullying Europe or even attacking Europe, the more the center-right will be able to play this up and kind of present a more European perspective, but it won't then be the classic kind of liberal, cosmopolitan vanguard Europe. It will be a more protectionist, geopolitical Europe that tries to stand on its own in a more volatile world order. So in that sense, I think it's really also a question: which Trump are we going to see most of in the coming years?
Thank you. I want to open up to questions. I know Sabina has a question. Can you read that, Jordan?
Could you comment on democratic backsliding in Germany in light of Peter's thesis on center-right party is the kingmaker now? Will the CDU, CSU under Merz stick to their claim that they will not enter into a coalition with the AfD?
Pieter, do you want to, or should I go first as the chairman? But I mean, it's not my research, and maybe
I'm about to suggest that.
Okay, maybe I'm naive, but I think at least for the time being, that's so like a coalition with the AfD is really unlikely in Germany. What we see and what I actually wouldn't have expected so quickly is that there is an erosion of the discourse. So like now in the election campaign, that the CDU, CSU are proposing it's at least for the time being, it's symbolic policies, but they are proposing votes on anti-migration policies, and they at least for now, they seem to be willing to accept votes also by the AfD necessary to reach a majority. That was, I think, very, or that's really a new development, a disturbing development. But in general, there's I wouldn't talk about, at least in an formal institutional sense, I don't think there's a risk of democratic backsliding in the near future. What Pieter said about this backsliding at the discursive level, definitely. I mean, that's already what you can, not only now in the elections, but that's something that you could see over the recent years. I mean, just an anecdotal example, but we have seen in the European election, in the election campaign to the European elections, we've seen a lot of bashing from the conservatives against the coalition at the time, in particular the Green Party. And I remember things like when members of the Green Party were intimidated by protesters, and then conservatives saying like, so violence has no place. But the Green Party is also partly responsible if they get these reactions. So that was a discursive really shift, saying like, we are against violence, but they kind of deserve it. But that's an anecdote, but I think it would have been under Merkel, it would have been unimaginable only until very recently. Yeah. Pieter, any?
No, I think you captured the most of it, Michael. One of the things things I find really fascinating in Germany, which in my eyes makes Germany rather unique, is the national memory of World War II, in what they in Germany call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which means dealing with the past, basically. And it is incomparable to any other country. Every country, I think, has a black page in history, or most countries do. Most European countries definitely do. But few of them have dealt with it as elaborately in terms of public debate, in terms of education, in terms of memory politics and musea and cultural remembrance, as Germany has in acknowledging the full blackness of that black page. Obviously, it was pretty black. We can all fairly easily agree on that, and most European countries do not have such an extreme dark side of history. But nevertheless, that kind of how deeply ingrained that was, and how thorough that debate was, and still resonates, makes for quite a resilient culture to anything that directly goes towards fascism. So Elon Musk's salute during the inauguration would absolutely cause an outrage in Germany now, as much as it would 30, 40 years ago. So that's one thing. But then we also have to take into account that modern Germany is two countries in one, West Germany and Eastern Germany, and that Vergangenheitsbewältigung was much more pronounced in Western Germany than it was in Eastern Germany, which then also translates in less robust resistance to democratic backsliding and far-right populism in the East than we see in the West. The AfD has a lot more support in former East Germany than it does in West Germany.
I hear the room, and I want to thank you for really excellent questions and excellent responses. I wonder, I have two parts of a question. One is about the countries that both of you are in, and because we've been concentrating on Eastern Europe, and it seems to me that the position of Geert Wilders as forming the government, the PVV, but also the news of Kittel and the process of the FKE should lead us to be questioning the extensive focus on Eastern Europe, if, especially in the case of the Benelux, if one of the founding members of the European post-war project is moving to the far right. But I also wonder then at a European level what the European People's Party plays here as a role. Because Manfred Weber immediately went and Ursula von der Leyen had courted Giorgia Meloni, and it creates a situation. And Weber tried to keep Fidesz in the coalition for a very long time. And those are all things that preceded this. So I do wonder. There has been an argument that the European Parliament made it possible for the far right to come into power. But it seems to me that the European People's Party it is, when we talk about center-right, we ignore the other part of what might be the center, right? And it seems to me that the center-right is faced to the right and not to the left at the moment. And I would appreciate both about the local political scene and about the European level political scene, because those two are now at this point hard to extract from each other.
I can start before I forget my thoughts on the. I mean, it's a great and very complex question, so I probably forget parts of my response, but a few thoughts. So I fully agree that I think it's there's a reason why so far the focus was mostly on Central and Eastern Europe, but that's not a. But I fully agree that it doesn't look like it's going to remain a phenomenon limited to Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, one article or an argument that I really like, also it's depressing, but by Enyedi, who argues that these leaders like Orban have been innovative, not just building on not at all building on their on their communist past, but really ideologically being innovative in this ethno-populist direction. And he has a forecast saying there might be a convergence in the future, but unfortunately not in the sense of a westernization of the East, but rather an easternization, that this ethno-populist rhetoric becomes more common and popular also in Western countries like in Austria. I do share the concerns about Kicker, definitely. I always thought if there hadn't been this Ibiza scandal, I don't know how, I mean, your question sounds like you are familiar with Austrian politics, but I thought Austria would be the third after Hungary and Poland. Hadn't been this Ibiza scandal under the Kurz coalition with the FPÖ. I think they were on the path to democratic backsliding already at the moment. And so your second part of your question regards the role of the European People's Party. And there I fully agree that in the past they've been complicit in providing cover for Hungarian backsliding for the first 10 years. And I don't think they split from Fidesz for principled reasons, that they were suddenly becoming defenders of EU fundamental values, but rather for strategic reasons. But I think that's what I tried to argue earlier, that there has been a shift, that it's become a potential liability for the center-right to be associated with Orban. And I mean, Weber I sit in Munich, is a Bavarian, and that's even among the German conservatives, that's, I would think, the least principled defenders of democratic values. But there was so the Bavarian conservatives had in 2018, I think, a regional election where they had tried to campaign or to really normalize towards the right, and like afterwards, and they lost, or I mean, they still won the election, but they always win the elections in Bavaria, but they lost in terms of relative vote share. And I remember the Prime Minister in Bavaria saying that was a near-death experience, and they really tried to draw less. I think it's for purely strategic reasons, but that they tried to distinguish themselves much more clearly from in the past, in particular during the refugee crisis in 2015. Viktor Orban was a very welcome guest for the Bavarian conservatives, and that has shifted. And that I think many people in this, like many potential voters for the center-right, do not like Orban and do not like democratic backsliding. So my hunch is that also, and I said earlier, I don't find it particularly relieving, but I think what Weber does in the European Parliament is that they normalize cooperation towards the right on other issues like migration, like eroding the Green Deal, and probably where they, I think, also are pretty close ideologically and in terms of policy positions, or more like for the conventional agriculture, these policies. But I'm not, at least I think the jury is still out whether they will also compromise on rule of law issues. I could imagine the opposite, and that's actually what happened with respect to the coalition talks now in Austria, that Weber said, and that's in the past that would have been perceived as a really illegitimate interference into domestic politics. But Weber said there are 3 red lines for the European People's Party if the Austrian conservatives build a coalition with the right extreme, and that's Europe, Ukraine, and rule of law. So I mean, we'll see how credible that is. But I mean, there's no red line on migration or climate policy, I think. But rule of law or undermining the judiciary. I mean, for example, in Austria, I think they do share even a policy position on probably undermining the independence of public public television or public broadcasting, but there's a certain awareness, I think, if they really try to attack, for example, the independent judiciary, as Orban did in Hungary or the Polish government did, I'm a bit more confident that this will become a problem for a coalition government.
Yeah, and when it comes to Dutch politics, first of all, I think you're fully right to identify that this is not a unique Central Eastern European problem. In fact, I think it's a global challenge that has faced many countries around the world in the past decades. And Western Europe certainly is not immune. Maybe a little bit less vulnerable because of the ingrained democratic culture elements that we discussed before, but certainly not immune to democratic backsliding. What we've seen in the Netherlands is that in November last year, the election result was a victory for Geert Wilders' PVV party, a far-right populist party. But to some extent, that electoral victory is easily overinterpreted, because it signifies a shift within electoral blocks as much as it does between electoral blocks. So the PVV party became the big dominant party on the far right side, where the center right was more split and less unified. So that's why the PVV also became the biggest party, which then immediately creates the impression, well, it's the biggest party that won the most, so its leader should now become prime minister. But it had to collaborate with the center-right and a few parties from within the center-right, because Dutch politics is quite fragmented. So now we have a coalition of 4 parties, one clear far-right party, one farmers' party that is somewhere mildly unclear between the far-right and the center-right, one center-right party, the Liberals, that is former Prime Minister Mark Rutte's major party. And then there's a new party called New Social Contract, whose main issue is rule of law. So it's a very strange coalition when it comes to democratic backsliding, to complete extreme opposites. And we have to take into account, for example, that this NSA, the New Social Contract Party, that makes good governance and rule of law its major issue, has also, for example, delivered the Minister of the Interior is a former judge from this party. So the current government contains extremes on this front. As long as migration is the biggest issue, and then in particular asylum seekers and the integration of asylum seekers, that will play into the wind of Geert Wilders, and he'll be able to dominate the discourse. But if other issues like security or climate change rise in salience, then it will be a different story. It is telling that there was an objection to him becoming prime minister, right? He claimed that right. He said, I'm the leader of the biggest party, therefore I have the right to become prime minister. But that's not how it works, because he needs to build a supporting coalition that has a majority in parliament. And his coalition partners, particularly this New Social Contract Party, said, well, we're willing to work along, but not if you become prime minister. And so they were able to prevent that. And now Dick Schoof is our prime minister, who is officially non-political. He was a senior civil servant before now becoming prime minister. So and the government has been very much in turmoil since. They're fighting with each other and fighting with the opposition. They need to negotiate with the opposition because they don't have a majority in the Senate, which they need to pass new laws. And it's been a very kind of unclear and turmoilish period. So I can't really say much about the direction of democratic backsliding in the Netherlands, other than that it is on the radar, partially because of Wilders' prominence and partially because of the conflict inside the governing coalition on this issue. And But there's also a lot of societal resistance from lawyers, barristers, journalists, trade unions, a lot of mobilization against possible democratic backsliding on the Wilders.
What role does the media play in EU/Europe with respect to the normalization of radical right positions?
Sorry, I didn't get the first part of the question. What role? Sorry.
What role does the media play in EU/Europe with respect to the normalization of radical right positions?
I can have a go at that. Thanks for this question. So let me focus on the media's role here on this. What I find really fascinating is the kind of coverage that people like Geert Wilders, Viktor Orban, Donald Trump get around the globe, and it's as simple as it is annoying to see how this is unfolding, because it's a very simple recipe, right? Say something outrageous, journalists will jump on it, cover it, and say, "Oh, look what kind of an outrageous statement this politician is making." It will generate backlash, and then play victim. That is the simple recipe. We all know it, we all see it, and yet it continues and it continues over and over again. And journalists keep jumping on it. So it's apparently very easy to play that game. And it can be used to divert attention, right? You can hollow out internal opposition and then redirect attention by making some outrageous, aggressive statements on Greenland or the Panama Canal or these kinds of issues. That will help put you in the spotlights. The PVV party in the Netherlands continuously proclaims a migration crisis. There's a crisis, and they partially also cultivate this by making sure there is not enough support for asylum seekers, which then more or less creates dire situations at these reception centers. And then they play up, see, there's a crisis. And that's it. It's a very simple game. And they know very well how to play that. And the journalists, the media more broadly, have not found a recipe to this. It's quite surprising, or not surprising, but interesting to see that far-right politicians are often the best-known politicians abroad. Right? So many Europeans outside of the Netherlands know who Geert Wilders is, and they have a hard time naming any other Dutch politician. And the same goes across the board, because these kind of resonant structures of saying something outrageous, getting coverage, and then play victim when the backlash comes, work across borders as much as they work inside. So yeah, this is a very good question. There's definitely a role that media play in amplifying and profiling the far right.
I don't really have much to add, Pieter. I think it's also your area of expertise, but I fully agree with. I guess that, I mean, the media, and of course also for often these provocations. I also sometimes wonder why are mainstream politicians not just paying less attention or ignoring. I mean, recently in Germany we had comments by Elon Musk without any substance, or even a Twitter X conversation with the AfD leader. But of course, everybody then, I guess the logic is that it's also used to mobilize their own constituency, of course, to show outrage against these interventions. And so the logic is it's still better to say something rather than ignoring it. But sometimes, of course, that's from a party logic, for the healthiness of the entire system, it would be better sometimes to be more relaxed and just ignore these provocations. But I guess that's one reason why then everybody, and not just, of course, the media, but also the political actors who then have to respond I think are part of that simple logic. I mean, I also remember that after the first Trump years, there was some self-criticism by the media, but it looks like they are doing exactly the same now. I mean, that every minor remark is creating immediately a big discussion, even if it's like the. I mean, I don't think there was any newspaper not discussing the Greenland question in depth over the last few weeks, like or the Panama question. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for your participation in this panel today. There was a lot of great insight from two very different special prowesses. And thank you so much, University of Pittsburgh. Thank you, and everybody that was at the panel today. Thank you very much.